Good evening, and welcome back to Lamplight History. I'm Henry, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day it's been, you can set it all down now. There is nothing left to do, and nowhere else to be. Make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften, and let your breathing slow. Close your eyes if you'd like to. I'll do the rest. Tonight, we're going to travel back almost 200 years to a small girl in a quiet palace who would one day give her name to an entire age of the world. Her name was Victoria. And for 63 years, she was the Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India and the most famous woman on earth. When she was born, no one expected her to matter very much at all. And when she died, the whole world seemed to pause, as if an age had quietly ended along with her. This is the story of her long life, told slowly and gently from the very beginning. There is no need to remember any of it. Just let the words carry you. So let us go back to a spring morning in London in the year 1819. Picture a great gray palace on the western edge of the city, half hidden among gardens still wet with dew. This is Kensington Palace. It is old and rather drafty and not really grand at all, and it is here that our story begins. Somewhere inside, behind tall shuttered windows, a baby has just been born. It is the 24th of May, 1819. The baby is a girl, small and plump, with wide blue eyes. Her father is Edward, Duke of Kent, one of the many sons of the old Mad King George III. Her mother is a German princess, Victoire, from a little duchy called Saxe-Coburg. They name the child Alexandrina Victoria. But everyone will simply call her Victoria, or, when she is small, Dina. Now, you might imagine that a princess born in a royal palace would be first in line for everything. But she was not. Her grandfather, the king, had a great many sons, and ahead of little Victoria stood a long row of uncles, any of whom might have children of their own. By all the ordinary rules, this baby should have grown up as a minor royal, far from the throne, half forgotten by history. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans, and it worked quietly and quickly. When Victoria was only 8 months old, her father, the Duke of Kent, caught a chill on a cold seaside holiday. Within days it turned to fever and then to pneumonia. He died in January 1820, before his daughter could ever know his face. 6 days later, her grandfather, the old king, died as well. And so, almost overnight, the whole shape of the family changed. One by one, over the years that followed, the old king's sons died without leaving living, legitimate children to follow them. And each time one of them passed, the small girl in Kensington Palace moved another quiet step closer to the crown. She did not know it yet. She was far too young. But the throne of England was slowly, surely, turning toward her. Her mother, the widowed Duchess of Kent, was left alone in a foreign country, with a baby, a mountain of her late husband's debts, and very little money of her own. She spoke poor English. She had few friends at the English court. And she was frightened in the way that lonely people in strange places are often frightened. Into that fear stepped a tall, charming, ambitious man named John Conroy. And he would shape Victoria's childhood more than almost anyone. John Conroy had been an officer in her late father's household, and now he made himself indispensable to the grieving Duchess. He managed her money. He managed her letters. He managed, little by little, almost every hour of her days. And he began to dream a great dream of his own. For he understood something the Duchess only half understood, that the little girl playing on the floor might one day be queen, and that whoever controlled the girl might one day control a kingdom. So Conroy and the Duchess built a world around Victoria, a careful, closed, controlling world. In later years, people would call it the Kensington system. The idea was simple and it was suffocating. Victoria was to be kept apart from everyone, dependent on her mother and on Conroy, and on no one else at all. She was never, for a single moment, to be left alone. And so she wasn't. She slept every night in her mother's bedroom, in a small bed beside the grown woman's larger one. She was never allowed to walk down a staircase without an adult holding her hand, not for her safety, they said, but so that she could never be seen to stand on her own. She met almost no other children. She had almost no friends her own age. Her whole world was a handful of adults and a great many rules. There were, though, small islands of warmth in that lonely childhood, and we should not forget them, for she never did. The first was her governess, a kind, sharp-eyed German woman named Louise Lezen. Lezen loved the girl fiercely and watched over her, and became something close to a second mother. And the second was her dolls. Victoria had a great wooden box, and inside it over 130 little dolls, most of them no taller than your hand. She dressed them herself in tiny costumes she and Lezen sewed by candlelight, and she gave each one a name and a character and a little history. Alone in that hushed palace, with almost no companions of flesh and blood, she built herself an entire miniature court of painted faces and ruled over it with perfect, gentle care. Her days were ordered like clockwork. Lessons in the morning always. History and geography and arithmetic and French and German and drawing and music, for she loved to sing. She was a bright child and a stubborn one, with a quick temper and a warm heart, and a will that no system, however clever, could ever quite close its hand around. And she kept a diary. From the age of 13, almost every night, she wrote down her day. She would keep that habit for nearly 70 years, filling volume after volume, and it is through those pages that we still hear her voice today. For a long time, no one told her plainly what her future was to be. But children understand more than we think. The story is often told of the day it finally became clear to her. She was 11 years old at her lessons when her governess slipped a chart of the kings and queens of England into her history book. Victoria studied it and saw the long line of names and slowly understood that the line ended one day with her. She was quiet for a moment. And then, so the story goes, she looked up and said simply, "I will be good." Perhaps it happened exactly like that. Perhaps the tale grew a little smoother in the telling, as such tales do. But it fits the child she was, and the woman she would become. For duty, that heavy and old-fashioned word, would sit at the very center of her long life, from that small schoolroom moment to the very end. As she grew older, the Kensington system only tightened its grip. Conroy wanted more than to guide her. He wanted power, real power, for himself. His plan was this. If the old king died while Victoria was still a child, before her 18th birthday, then someone would have to rule in her place as regent. And that someone would be her mother, guided, of course, by Conroy. So he needed her to stay a child, dependent and obedient, for as long as he possibly could. But Victoria was growing up, and she was growing stubborn, and she had begun quietly to hate him. She saw how he treated her beloved mother. She saw how he bullied the servants. She saw how he schemed. And beneath her careful, obedient surface, a hard little core of resistance was forming. She could not fight him openly. She was a girl watched every hour of every day. But she could wait. And she was very, very good at waiting. There came a moment when the struggle broke into the open. Victoria fell seriously ill with a fever at Ramsgate by the sea. Weak and frightened in her sickbed, she was pressed by Conroy and even by her mother to sign a paper, a promise that when she became queen, she would make him her private secretary and give him a place at the heart of her reign. Sick as she was, the girl refused. Again and again she refused. It was one of the first true victories of her life, won not with power, but with sheer will. Through all of this, she was not entirely alone in the world. Far away in Germany, she had family who loved her, and one uncle in particular who watched over her from a distance. His name was Leopold, her mother's brother, who had become the king of the Belgians. He wrote her long, wise, affectionate letters, full of advice about how a young sovereign ought to think and behave and rule. And Leopold had a plan for her happiness, too. A plan that involved a certain young cousin of hers, a boy named Albert. But that we will come to in its own good time. The years turned. The king upon the throne was now William IV, an old sailor of a king, bluff and kindly and rather eccentric. He was Victoria's uncle, and he was very fond of her, and he could not stand her mother or John Conroy, whom he rightly suspected of trying to steal his young heir away. And so a strange, tense game was played out over the head of the growing girl, between the old king in his palace and the little court at Kensington. King William had one great wish. He wanted to live long enough for Victoria to turn 18, so that she could rule in her own right, and her mother and Conroy would never get their regency. He said so once out loud at a great dinner in front of 100 guests, with the Duchess of Kent sitting right beside him. It was a shocking and rather magnificent and deeply awkward moment. "I trust in God," he declared, "that my life may be spared for 9 months longer." And then he glared down the table at the Duchess. As it happened, God, and the old king's stubbornness, granted the wish, but only just. On the 24th of May, 1837, Victoria turned 18 years old. She was at last of age. There would be no regency. If she became queen now, she would be queen entirely on her own. And the old king was fading fast. Less than a month later, at Windsor Castle, King William IV lay dying. In the early hours of the 20th of June, 1837, his long life came quietly to its end. And in that same dark hour, messengers were already climbing into their saddles, ready to ride through the sleeping countryside toward Kensington, to wake a teenage girl and tell her that she was now the queen. It was still not yet dawn when they reached the palace. The great doors were shut, the household asleep. They knocked and waited and knocked again, and it took some time before anyone would rouse themselves to let 2 urgent, travel-stained gentlemen inside. They asked to see the queen. The servants hesitated, unsure. And so the men said it plainly. "We are come on business of state, to the queen, and even her sleep must give way to that." Victoria was woken by her mother, and told that important men were waiting for her below. She rose and put on a simple dressing gown, and went down to meet them, her hair still loose about her shoulders. And there, in the gray light of that summer morning, they knelt before her, this girl of 18, and told her that her uncle was dead, and that she was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. She was, they said, perfectly calm. She listened. She thanked them. And in that moment, everything she had waited for, and dreaded, and dreamed of quietly came true. That very day, she wrote in her diary, in her round, careful hand, words that have echoed ever since. "Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this station," she wrote, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things, inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." 18 years old, and already she knew exactly who she meant to be. And then, in her very first hours as queen, she did a small thing that told the whole world how the wind had changed. She asked to be left alone. Just for an hour. Alone, entirely alone, with no adult holding her hand, no mother in the room, no John Conroy hovering at her shoulder. For a girl who had never in her life spent a single hour by herself, it was a kind of declaration. The Kensington system was over. The queen would rule herself. That same morning, she held her first privy council, a great meeting of the most powerful men in the kingdom, dukes and ministers and lords, gray-haired and grave. They gathered in a large room, expecting, perhaps, a nervous, overwhelmed child. And instead a small, composed young woman walked in alone, sat down, and quietly took command of the room. The hardened old politicians were astonished. She was so calm, so clear, so completely unafraid. One of them wrote that she looked as if she had been doing it all her life. One of her first acts was to put a firm and gentle distance between herself and the two people who had ruled her childhood. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, was moved to distant rooms, far from the Queen's own. And John Conroy, the man who had dreamed of ruling through her, was frozen out entirely and would never hold the power he craved. It was done without shouting, without cruelty. It was simply done. The waiting was over, and now the will she had guarded for so long was free. Within weeks, she left Kensington Palace forever, the quiet, drafty house where she had been so lonely and so watched for all of her 18 years. She moved into a grand new home in the heart of London, a palace her uncles had built but never really lived in. Its name was Buckingham Palace, and she was the very first sovereign to make it her home. It has been the home of British monarchs ever since. Imagine what it must have felt like for a girl kept so small for so long to suddenly hold the whole weight of a kingdom in her young hands. She was queen of the most powerful nation on earth at the dawn of a new industrial age. Steam engines were spreading across the land. Railways were being laid. Great cities were rising in smoke and iron. And at the center of it all sat a young woman not yet 20, who still slept with her childhood dolls not far away. She was not, of course, entirely without guidance. And here we meet one of the great figures of her early reign, a man she came to love almost like a father. His name was Lord Melbourne. He was the Prime Minister, an elegant, witty, worldly, rather melancholy widower in his late 50s. And from her very first days as queen, he became her constant companion, her teacher, and her dearest friend. Every day, Lord Melbourne came to her. They rode together and dined together and sat together for hours, and he taught her patiently the strange and difficult art of being a monarch. He explained the workings of government and the tangles of politics and the histories of the great families, all wrapped in charm and gossip and gentle laughter. For a girl who had grown up with so little affection, this kind, clever older man was like sunlight after a long gray winter. She adored him. Her diary in those years is full of him. Lord Melbourne said this. Lord Melbourne thinks that. I sat next to Lord Melbourne and we talked, and it was so pleasant. He, in turn, was quite devoted to her, this tired, sad, brilliant man, near the end of his career, suddenly given a young queen to guide and to protect. It was one of the great friendships of her life. And for a time, in those first bright years, being queen felt less like a burden and more like a wonderful, endless adventure. For she was young and she loved to live. She loved to dance, sometimes until the small hours of the morning, until her feet ached and the candles burned low. She loved to ride, fast and fearless, across the parks and the countryside. She loved music and the opera and beautiful clothes and staying up far too late and all the pleasures that had been kept from her for so long. After 18 years in a cage, the young queen had thrown open the door, and she meant to enjoy her freedom to the full. But being queen was never only pleasure. Even in those early days, she learned how quickly a crowd that adores you can turn, and how sharp the world can be. There was a scandal at court, a sad and ugly affair, in which the young queen misjudged a situation badly, and a lady of the household was falsely suspected of a shameful secret. Victoria took a hard line, and the public, who had cheered her, suddenly hissed and booed her carriage in the street. It was a bitter early lesson. Even a queen could be wrong, and even a queen could be hated. And there was politics, too, which pressed upon her more heavily as the months went by. Her beloved Lord Melbourne led one great party, and when his government began to weaken, she faced the frightening prospect of losing him and of having to work with men she did not know and did not trust. She was learning, painfully, that a queen does not simply do as she pleases. She stands above the parties, and yet is pulled by all of them, and must find her way with care. But before we follow her deeper into the world of power, let us pause on the day when she stood before her whole nation, and was crowned. It was the 28th of June, 1838, a little over a year after she became queen. And on that summer morning, London gave itself over entirely to celebration. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the city, more than anyone could count. They filled the streets and the parks and every window and rooftop along the route. They had come from every corner of the land, farmers and factory workers and fine ladies, all pressed together in the warm June air, waiting for a glimpse of their young queen. The whole capital was decked in flags and flowers and ribbons, and the sound of the crowd was like the sound of the sea. At last the great procession set out from Buckingham Palace, winding slowly through the packed streets toward Westminster Abbey. And in the golden state coach, drawn by 8 cream-colored horses, sat Victoria, small and upright, in her robes, waving to the ocean of faces that roared its love for her. She wrote later that she could hardly believe so many people had come, only to see her, and that it filled her heart almost to breaking. Inside the ancient abbey, where English kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 800 years, the great and the powerful were gathered in their thousands. Peers in crimson and ermine, bishops in gold, foreign princes and ambassadors, and a blaze of jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles beneath the soaring stone. Into that vast and glittering space walked one small young woman, to be made a queen before God. The ceremony was long and old and strange, and not everyone quite knew what they were doing, for there had not been a coronation like it in many years. There were prayers and anthems and ancient oaths. She was anointed with holy oil. She was robed and enthroned, and the great crown of England was lowered onto her head. And in that instant, a great shout went up, and the peers put on their own coronets, and the trumpets sounded, and outside the guns began to fire across the city. There were small mishaps, as there always are in such great and human occasions. An elderly lord, climbing the steps to pay her homage, stumbled and fell and rolled back down, and the young queen rose at once to help him, with a kindness the whole abbey noticed. And the coronation ring, made a little too small, was forced onto the wrong finger, and afterward she had to bathe her hand in ice water for a long time before it would come off again. But through it all, she carried herself with a grace far beyond her 19 years. Those who were there never forgot the sight of her. So young, so small, so entirely alone at the center of all that vast and ancient splendor, and yet so calm, so dignified, so completely equal to the enormous thing that was happening to her. When at last it was over, she rode home again through the cheering streets, the crown of a great empire now truly her own. And what did the new crowned queen do on the evening of the most magnificent day of her life, after the crowds and the crown and the roar of the guns? She went home to Buckingham Palace. She took off her heavy robes, and she ran upstairs, we are told, to give her little dog, a spaniel named Dash, his evening bath. A queen by day before all the world. And still, in the quiet of the evening, a young girl who loved her dog. There is something in that, I think, worth carrying with you into sleep. So there she stands as we close this first part of our story. Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, not yet 20 years old. Free at last of the long, lonely cage of her childhood. Adored by her people. Guided by a friend she loved. Mistress of her own life and of a great and growing empire. It seemed as though the whole world lay open before her, bright and full of promise. And yet the truest happiness of her life had not yet even begun. For she was still alone in the deepest sense. Beloved by millions, surrounded by ministers and courtiers, and still at heart, a young woman who had never once been truly, simply loved, as one person loves another. That was about to change. Far away, in a small German court, her cousin Albert was growing into a serious, thoughtful, handsome young man. And their two lives were about to meet. But that is where we will slow down and let the daylight fade and let the rest of the story unfold in the dark while you drift towards sleep. There is no need to stay awake for it. The tale will go on, gently, whether your eyes are open or closed. Let it become like a soft voice in another room, warm and far away. Everything is taken care of. There is nothing you need to do. Nothing at all. So let your body grow heavy now, and let the bed hold all of your weight. Let the small worries of the day loosen their grip, one by one, and float away into the dark. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out slower still. And again. With every breath, sink a little deeper into rest. The young queen has been crowned. The candles are burning low. And the long, remarkable story of her life is only just beginning. We left our young queen crowned and free and adored, and yet, in the quietest part of herself, still quite alone. Tonight, in the gentle dark, let us follow her as she finds the one great love of her life. There is nothing for you to do but listen, and drift, and rest. To find him, we must travel away from London, across the sea, to a small green country in the heart of Germany. It was called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a little duchy of forests and rivers and old stone castles, the same family, you may remember, from which Victoria's own mother had come. And there, in a castle on a wooded hill, 3 years after Victoria herself, a boy had been born. His name was Albert. He was her first cousin, and from the moment of his birth, there were those who dreamed that one day he and Victoria might marry. Chief among those dreamers was their shared uncle, Leopold, the wise king of the Belgians, who had watched over Victoria's childhood through his long letters. Leopold loved them both, and he had quietly decided years in advance that these two cousins were meant for one another. Albert grew up thoughtful and serious, and rather grave for so young a boy. Where Victoria was all warmth and impulse and quick feeling, Albert was cool and careful and deeply earnest. He loved books and music and science, and long walks in the forest, and the ordering of ideas into their proper places. His own childhood had not been happy. When he was only 5, his parents' marriage collapsed in scandal, and his mother was sent away, never to see her children again. Albert never forgot it. It left in him a horror of disorder and a longing for a settled, faithful, loving home, the very thing he had lost. He was educated with great care, for Leopold and his advisors meant him to be worthy of a queen. He studied at the university and traveled and trained his mind, and grew into a tall, handsome, high-minded young man, a little shy, a little stiff, and quietly determined to be good and useful in the world. The two cousins had first met once before, when they were both just 17. Albert had come to England to visit, and the young Victoria, not yet queen, had thought him very handsome, and had noted in her diary that he was full of goodness, and that his eyes were large and blue, and that he had a beautiful figure. But nothing was settled. They were children still, and she was not yet ready. Now, 3 years later, everything was different. Victoria was queen. She was mistress of her own life. And, if truth be told, she was in no hurry at all to give any of that hard-won freedom away. for marriage to her was a complicated thing. She had waited her whole life to be free of other people's control, and here was everyone, her uncle Leopold especially, gently pushing her toward a husband. Part of her resisted. Why should she marry at all? She was doing very well on her own. And there was another difficulty, one peculiar to her strange position. She was the queen. There was no man in all the world who outranked her. And so, by the iron rules of royalty, she could not be proposed to. If there was to be a marriage, she would have to do the asking herself. So it was with mixed feelings, in October of 1839, that Victoria waited at Windsor Castle for Albert to arrive once more from Germany, this time so that she might look at him properly, as a woman looks at a man she is thinking of marrying. And then he walked in. And in a single moment, all her hesitation simply fell away. He had grown from a handsome boy into a strikingly beautiful young man, tall and elegant, with those same large blue eyes she had remembered. Victoria was, quite frankly, dazzled. Her diary in those days overflows with him. "Albert is beautiful," she wrote. It was, on her side at least, something very close to love at first sight all over again. For 5 days she watched him and danced with him and rode with him and fell hour by hour more completely under his spell. And at last she knew her own mind. She would marry him. There was now no question of it. And so, because she was the queen, she did the asking. On a gray October morning, she sent for him and received him alone in her private rooms. And there, this young woman who ruled an empire, nervous as any girl, told him how happy it would make her if he would consent to marry her. He consented. Of course he consented. And the two of them, overwhelmed, held each other and wept a little, and Victoria felt, she wrote that night, that she was the happiest of human beings. After a childhood with so little tenderness in it, she had found, at last, someone entirely her own. The engagement was a season of pure joy for her. She had never been in love before, and she gave herself to it completely, with all the fierce warmth of her nature. She showered him with gifts and letters and endearments. She could hardly bear the days until the wedding. But even in her happiness, the old troubles of power crept in. When it came time to arrange Albert's rank and his money and his place in her strange kingdom, she discovered how little the English establishment wished to give this unknown young German prince. Parliament granted him a smaller income than she had hoped. He was denied the title she wanted for him. Proud men muttered that a poor foreign princeling had done very well for himself, snapping up the Queen of England. It stung Albert deeply, and it stung Victoria on his behalf, and it was a bitter first taste of the coldness that England would so often show him. Still, none of it could stop the wedding. And so we come to the 10th of February, in the year 1840. It was a wild, wet, blustery winter morning in London, the rain coming down in sheets. And yet, once again, the crowds came out in their tens of thousands, standing patient and soaked along the streets, cheering their young queen as she rode to be married. The wedding was held in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. And Victoria, on that day, did something that would quietly change the world for generations of brides to come. She wore white. A gown of rich white silk and delicate lace, simple and pure and gleaming, with a wreath of orange blossom in her hair instead of a crown. It was not, at the time, the ordinary thing to do. Royal brides had often married in silver, or in color, in heavy state robes. But Victoria wore white, for love and for simplicity, and she looked, everyone agreed, radiant. And because she was the most famous woman in the world, other women began to copy her. Slowly, and then everywhere, the white wedding dress became the thing a bride was meant to wear. To this day, when a woman walks down the aisle in white, she is following, whether she knows it or not, a young queen on a rainy morning in 1840. The ceremony itself was brief and solemn and deeply moving to her. She made her vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and to honor, and yes, even to obey, this word which, for a reigning queen, carried a strange and complicated weight. And Albert placed the ring upon her finger, and they were man and wife. That night, they went to Windsor for a brief honeymoon, only a few days, for the Queen could not be spared for long from her duties. And Victoria wrote in her diary words so full of tender happiness that they are almost too private to read. It was, she said, the happiest day of her life. She could scarcely believe that this beautiful, gentle man was truly, and forever, her own. And so began one of the great marriages of history. But it did not begin smoothly. For the truth is that the first years of their life together were hard, and often unhappy, and full of a struggle that neither of them had quite expected. The trouble was this: Victoria was the queen. Albert was only her husband. In their public life, she held every scrap of the power, and he held none at all. She ruled a kingdom. He, at first, was given almost nothing to do. He was not allowed to see the state papers. He was shut out of the business of government. He was, as he bitterly put it, the master in the house, and yet not even the master of his own household. He was, he said, only the husband and not the master. For a serious, capable, hard-working young man, full of ideas and eager to be useful, it was a kind of slow torture. He had left his home and his country and his language to come and live in a cold and unwelcoming land, and there he found himself with no real role, no real work, and no real power, forever walking a respectful step behind his own wife. And Victoria, for her part, guarded her power fiercely. She loved Albert with all her heart, but she was the queen, and she had fought too hard for her independence to give it away, even to him. In those early days, when he offered his opinions on matters of state, she would gently, or not so gently, remind him that these things were her affair and not his. They quarreled. Two strong wills, two proud hearts, shut up together in the strange hothouse of a palace. She had a fierce temper, quick to flare. He was cold and withdrawing when hurt, retreating into silence, and long, careful letters slipped under her door. They loved each other deeply, and they wounded each other often, and slowly, painfully, they had to learn how to be married. What changed things in the end was the arrival of children and the quiet, patient competence of Albert himself. Their first child was born just 9 months after the wedding, in November of 1840. It was a girl whom they named Victoria after her mother, but always called Vicky. The Queen, it must be said, did not much enjoy the business of babies. She found pregnancy tiresome and undignified, and newborn infants, she confessed, rather frog-like and unlovely. But she did her duty as she always did. And here, in the nursery, Albert at last found a door into the heart of things. For Victoria, pregnant and unwell and overwhelmed, increasingly leaned upon him. He took charge where she could not. He read the papers she was too tired to read. He sat in on her meetings. He organized and advised and steadied everything around her. A year after Vicky came a son, the longed-for heir, born in November of 1841. They named him Albert Edward, and he would one day be king. And with an heir secured, the young family's place felt solid at last. Over the next 17 years, Victoria would give birth 9 times in all, to 4 sons and 5 daughters, an extraordinary number, and every one of them lived to grow up, which in that age was a rare blessing indeed. The royal nursery became a crowded, noisy, bustling world of its own. And with each new child, and each new year, Albert's quiet influence grew, until at last he was king in all but name. He became, in truth, Victoria's private secretary, her closest advisor, the sharer of every burden. The 2 desks in their study were pushed side by side, and they worked there together, hour after hour, on the endless business of the crown. And what a worker he was, this serious young prince. Once he had found his footing, Albert threw himself into 100 labors with a tireless, methodical energy that astonished everyone around him. He set the royal finances in order, which had long been a shambles, and made the crown solvent and respectable. He reorganized the great royal estates and took up the newest ideas in farming and drained fields and built model cottages for the workers, wanting to show how the land might be run with both profit and decency. But his vision reached far beyond the palace walls. He believed, deeply and ahead of his time, that science and art and industry and education were the great engines that could lift up all of humankind. He lent his name and his tireless work to colleges and museums and learned societies. He championed the cause of the working man and even spoke out carefully against the evil of slavery still festering in the wider world. He was, in truth, a reformer and a thinker of the first rank, trapped in the awkward, powerless role of a queen's husband, and he poured all his frustrated ability into doing good wherever he was allowed. Cost him dearly. He drove himself without mercy, working late into every night, bent over his papers by candlelight, careless of his own health, his body slowly wearing away beneath the weight he laid upon it. He was not a strong man, and he did not spare himself, and those who loved him watched with worry as the years of ceaseless labor etched themselves ever deeper into his tired face. She came to depend on him utterly. Where once she had guarded her power against him, now she handed it to him gladly, trusting his cool, careful judgment above her own hot, quick instincts. "We are so entirely one," she wrote, "that any separation is unbearable." He had become, she said, the very center and soul of her life. And so the struggle of those early years resolved itself into one of the great partnerships of the century. She gave him her love and, in time, her power. He gave her order and purpose and a settled, faithful home, the very thing he had longed for since his own broken childhood. Together, they set about remaking the monarchy itself. For the throne Victoria had inherited was not much loved. Her wicked, foolish uncles had dragged the crown through scandal and debt and ridicule. The monarchy seemed old and tired and faintly disreputable. And Victoria and Albert, without ever quite announcing it, decided to make it something new. They would make it respectable. They would make it a model of family life, of duty, of hard work and clean living and moral seriousness. The Queen and her husband and their many children would become a kind of picture, held up before the whole nation, of what a good and loving family ought to be. It was Albert's vision above all, this earnest, high-minded idea of monarchy as an example. And it suited the mood of the age, an age growing more serious, more middle class, more devoted to home and hearth and respectability. The image of the royal family, gathered happily around the fire, became one of the most powerful and beloved images of the whole century. And they built homes to live that vision in. They were never quite happy in the grand old state palaces, with their crowds of courtiers and their lack of privacy. And so they made places of their own. On the Isle of Wight by the sea, they built a beautiful Italian-style house called Osborne, where the children could run on the beach and Albert could plant trees and the family could be, for a little while, simply a family. And far away in the Scottish Highlands, among the heather and the mountains and the cold, clean air, they built a castle called Balmoral, which Victoria came to love above all the places on earth. There, in the wild north, she was happiest. She and Albert would walk for miles over the hills. They loved the simple Highland people and the pipes and the great silent glens. Balmoral became their refuge, their true home of the heart, far from the smoke and noise and endless demands of London. Let us linger there a while at Balmoral, for it is a peaceful place to rest the mind. Picture the long Highland days of that happy time. In the mornings the mist would lie low along the river, and the air would be cool and clean and smelling of heather and pine. Albert would go out onto the hills with the local gillies, the Highland attendants who knew every path and stream, among them a strong young man named John Brown, who would one day come to mean so much to the widowed queen. And Victoria would walk or ride her sturdy pony up the winding tracks, stopping to sketch the mountains and the lochs in her little book, for she drew all her life and rather well. They would picnic among the bracken, the whole family together, the children scrambling over the rocks. They would visit the cottages of the ordinary folk, and Victoria, who cared nothing for grandeur, loved to sit in their plain kitchens and take tea and ask after their children and their sheep and their small joys and sorrows. In the evenings, when the light at last drained slowly from the northern sky, they would gather by the fire in the castle, the room warm with the smell of wood smoke, tartan on every chair and curtain and carpet, for Albert had decorated the whole place in the bold checked patterns of Scotland. There would be music, and reels danced to the skirl of the pipes, and quiet talk, and the deep, restful silence of the mountains pressing in all around. It was, for Victoria, as close to perfect happiness as her life ever came. And in later years, in all her long sorrow, it was to these Highland evenings that her mind would return, again and again, like a traveler remembering a warm-lit window far behind on a dark road. Let us pause here a moment, in the quiet, and simply picture her as she was, this woman at the center of so vast a world. For she was not at all what you might imagine a great empress to be. She was tiny, for one thing, barely 5 feet tall, small and round, with those wide, rather protruding blue eyes, and a soft, low, musical voice that everyone who heard it remembered. She was not beautiful, and she knew it and did not much mind. But she had presence, an extraordinary presence. When she entered a room, the greatest men in the world fell silent. There was something in her steady, level gaze and her perfect stillness that made even hardened statesmen feel like nervous schoolboys. In her nature, she was all warmth and fire. She felt everything intensely, loved fiercely, wept easily, and lost her temper in sudden bright flashes that blew over as quickly as they came. She had no talent at all for hiding her feelings, and no wish to learn. She was honest to the point of bluntness, and she despised pretense and flattery, unless, as with dear Disraeli, it was so charming that she could not help enjoying it. The world remembers her as stern and gloomy, a grim old woman in black who was famously never amused. But that picture is only half true, and it belongs mostly to her later, grieving years. In her youth, and among those she trusted, she laughed and laughed, a warm, delighted, unstoppable laugh, throwing her whole small self into it. She loved to dance and to sing and to sketch and to ride, and above all she loved simply to be happy, which for much of her life she was. Her days had a shape she kept for 60 years. She rose and worked. Always, every day of her long reign, there came to her the red leather boxes, the dispatch boxes, filled with the papers of government, and she read them, every one, and signed them and understood them, with a steady diligence that never once failed her in all her years. Whatever else she was never idle, and never careless of her duty. She had her small, human quirks, too, the kind that make a person real. She ate remarkably fast, bolting her food, and by the strict rule of the court, the moment the queen finished a course, every plate was whisked away, so that many a hungry guest, seated far down the table and eating slowly, found their dinner snatched from under them barely touched. She loved fresh air and cold rooms, and kept her palaces so chilly that visitors shivered in their furs, while the queen sat perfectly content. She adored her dogs and her ponies and the plain, honest company of ordinary country folk far more than the polished chatter of the court. And all around this small, warm, stubborn woman, the world was changing faster than it ever had before. Hers was the age of the railway and the steamship, of gaslight glowing along the evening streets, of the electric telegraph carrying words beneath the very oceans. It was the age of the penny post, when for the first time an ordinary person could send a letter across the country for a single copper coin. It was the age of the great novelists, of Dickens and his crowded, teeming London, and of the new and unsettling ideas of science, of a naturalist named Darwin who dared to ask where all living things had truly come from. It was an age drunk on progress, certain that the world was climbing year by year toward something better and brighter. Cities swelled. Fortunes were made. Machines multiplied. And through all that noise and smoke and restless invention, the little woman at the heart of it all remained a fixed and steady point, the still center of a spinning world, her name already being given, while she yet lived, to the whole extraordinary age. She loved the new art of photography, and was one of the first monarchs in history to be truly known to her people by her photographed face, rather than by coins and painted portraits alone. Ordinary families kept her picture on the mantelpiece, this familiar, matronly figure, and felt they knew her, as no people had ever quite known a monarch before. She was, in a way the world had never seen, everybody's queen. And yet, even in the midst of all this happiness, the crown was never quite a safe thing to wear. For there were those in that restless century who wished the young queen harm. Rest easy now, for she comes through it all unhurt. But you should know how brave she was. Again and again, over the years, men stepped out of the London crowds and pointed pistols at her carriage as she drove by. It happened more than once. It happened, in fact, several times across her reign, more attempts on her life than most people today ever realize. The first came when she was young and newly married and expecting her first child. She and Albert were driving out in an open carriage when a man raised a pistol and fired at her, and then a second. By some mercy, both shots missed. And what did the young queen do? She insisted on driving on in her open carriage in full view so that her people should see that she was not afraid. It was, sadly, only the first of many. 2 years later, a man stepped from the crowd and fired at her carriage and escaped, and then, extraordinarily, the queen deliberately drove out along the very same route the next day, as bait to draw him out again so that he might be caught. And caught he was. It was an act of cold, astonishing courage, and it was entirely in keeping with the woman she was. Only weeks after that, another man aimed a pistol at her. A poor, deformed boy with a weapon half filled with rubbish, more a cry of despair than a true attempt on her life. And still the attempts went on down the years. Another shot from a discharged soldier some years later. And on one occasion the danger came not from a gun at all, but from a man who struck her across the face with a heavy cane as she sat in her carriage, bruising her badly and crushing her bonnet. It was the only time any of her attackers ever truly managed to harm her, and even then she went out that same evening bruised and shaken to the opera, so that her people should see she was not cowed. The last of these attempts came when she was already an old woman at Windsor, when a man fired a pistol at her as she arrived at the railway station. He was set upon at once, and, of all things, 2 schoolboys from nearby Eton beat the would-be assassin down with their umbrellas. And afterward Victoria said a thing that captures her whole spirit better than any speech. "It is worth being shot at," she remarked, "to see how much one is loved." For each time she survived, the love of her people rose up around her like a tide, and she felt it, and it strengthened her, and she was never once frightened into hiding. That was the heart of her, beneath all the shyness and the temper. A deep, stubborn, unshakable courage. She would not hide. She would not cower behind walls and guards. Time and again, after each attempt, she showed herself openly to her people, and they loved her all the more fiercely for it. But let us turn from danger to one of the proudest and happiest moments of her whole reign, and of Albert's, the great triumph that crowned their partnership. It was called the Great Exhibition, and it opened in the summer of 1851. The idea was Albert's, and it was a grand and generous one. He wished to gather under one roof the wonders of the whole world, the finest machines and crafts and works of art and inventions from every nation on earth, so that all people might come and see how far human skill and industry had climbed. Many mocked the idea. It was too big, too strange, too expensive, they said. It would fail and take poor Albert's reputation down with it. But Albert worked at it with all his tireless energy, and slowly, against all the doubters, he made it real. They built to house it one of the most astonishing buildings the world had ever seen. It was made almost entirely of iron and glass, a vast, shimmering, transparent palace, so light and airy that it seemed hardly to touch the ground. They raised it in Hyde Park in the heart of London, and the people called it the Crystal Palace. Imagine it. A building of glass longer than a great cathedral, glittering in the sun, so tall that it enclosed whole living elm trees inside it. Beneath that shining roof were gathered 100,000 objects from around the globe. Steam engines and diamonds, silks and sculptures, machines that could do the work of 100 hands. On the 1st of May, 1851, Victoria herself opened it, and it was, she wrote, one of the greatest and most glorious days of her life. She was overwhelmed with pride and with love for Albert, whose vision this had been, and who had been so doubted, and was now so gloriously proved right. The people came in their millions, more than 6 million visits in all in the months the exhibition stood. They came by the new railways, from every town and village, ordinary working men and women who had never before traveled far from home, all pouring into London to see the wonders of the age. It was, in a way, the moment when the modern world first showed itself its own face. Imagine walking beneath that vast glittering roof of glass, the sunlight pouring down through it, the whole enormous space filled with a soft green light from the living elm trees that grew inside. There were fountains playing, one carved entirely from pink glass, sparkling in the sun. There were machines the size of houses, hissing and turning, weaving cloth and printing pages before your very eyes. There were exhibits from every corner of the earth, silks from India and furs from Canada, carvings and jewels and strange inventions whose purpose no one could quite guess. And there, drawing the greatest crowds of all, behind a cage of iron bars, sat the most famous diamond in the world, the great Koh-i-Noor, the mountain of light, brought from India to lie among the treasures of the Queen. People queued for hours simply to gaze at it. Whole families wandered the endless aisles from morning until night, footsore and wide-eyed, ordinary people rubbing shoulders with duchesses, all of them together struck silent with wonder at what human hands had made. There had never been anything like it in the history of the world, and for one long golden summer, it seemed that all the peoples of the earth had come together, in peace, to marvel. And it made a great deal of money, too, which Albert, ever practical, used to found museums and colleges that still stand in London to this day. It was his masterpiece. And for Victoria, it was the summit of their life together, the moment when her beloved husband stood before the whole world, and the whole world at last saw his worth. For this was the great age of British confidence and British power. Under Victoria, the small islands she ruled had become the workshop of the world, and the center of an empire such as history had never seen. Her ships sailed every ocean. Her red-coated soldiers marched on every continent. The map of the world was being painted year by year in the pink and red of British rule across India and Africa and Canada and Australia and 1,000 islands between. It would grow in time into the largest empire the world has ever known, an empire on which, as the proud saying went, the sun never set. At home, it was an age of iron and steam and ceaseless change. Railways spread across the land like veins. Great factories rose in the northern cities, their chimneys darkening the sky. Telegraph wires carried words faster than any horse could run. The world was being remade faster than in all the centuries before, and it was happening under her name in what men were already beginning to call the Victorian Age. Yet not all of her realm shared in that glittering progress, and the darkest chapter of these years unfolded not in some distant land, but close to home, across the sea in Ireland. It began quietly in the autumn of 1845, when a strange blight fell upon the potato crop, turning the plants black in the fields and rotting the potatoes in the ground. For the poor of Ireland, the potato was not merely one food among many. It was almost the only food they had. And when the crop failed and failed again the next year, and the year after that, a famine of terrible proportions swept the land. People starved in their cottages, and by the roadsides, and in the ditches. Fever followed hunger, as it always does, and carried off many more. It was one of the great catastrophes of the century. Before it ended, around 1 million people had died, and another 1 million and more had fled across the ocean, crammed into crowded sailing ships bound for America, ships so deadly with disease that they came to be called the coffin ships. Ireland lost, in a few short years, 1/4 of all its people to death and to exile, and it would never be the same again. The response of the government of the day was, by any honest reckoning, far too little, hampered by the hard economic doctrines of the time, and by a fatal slowness to grasp the scale of the disaster. Victoria herself gave money from her own purse, a considerable sum, and lent her name to the appeals for relief. But it was as nothing against so vast a tragedy, and the bitterness of those years lay heavy on the land for generations. It is a sorrowful thread woven through the bright fabric of her reign, and we should not pass it by without a moment's quiet remembrance. But such power and such change were bought at a heavy human cost, and Victoria's century was one of war as well as wonder. And the greatest war of her middle years was fought far away, in a cold and distant land, against the Empire of Russia. History remembers it as the Crimean War. It began in 1854, and it was a grim and bloody and badly managed affair. British soldiers were sent across the sea to fight on the shores of the Black Sea, and there they suffered terribly, not only from the enemy, but from cold and hunger and disease and the blundering of their own commanders. News of their suffering came home as it never had before, for this was the first great war reported by telegraph and by newspaper correspondents on the ground. For the first time, ordinary people at home read, within days, of the horrors their sons and husbands were enduring at the front. The nation was shaken and angered and moved to pity. And out of that suffering rose one of the great figures of the age, a quiet, determined woman named Florence Nightingale, who went out to the war with a band of nurses and brought care and cleanliness and mercy to the dying men in the filthy military hospitals. She walked the wards at night with her lamp, and the soldiers called her the Lady with the Lamp, and she changed forever the way the world thought of nursing and of caring for the wounded. The hospitals she found were places of horror, worse in their way than the battlefield itself. Wounded men lay in their thousands on bare floors in filth, without clean water or bandages or decent food, dying not so much of their wounds as of the diseases that bred in that squalor. Far more soldiers died in those beds than ever fell to enemy fire. And Florence Nightingale, with her fierce will and her genius for order, swept through it all like a cleansing wind. She scrubbed the wards and organized the kitchens, and demanded clean linen and fresh air, and slowly the dying stopped and the men began to live. The soldiers worshipped her. Rough, hardened men would kiss her shadow as it fell across their beds when she passed by in the night. And when the war was over, she did not rest, but spent the long remainder of her life reforming the whole world of medicine and nursing, so that such needless suffering might never happen again. Victoria admired her greatly, and met her and listened to her, and lent her royal weight to the great reforms of army medical care that followed. It was one of the few good things to come out of that grim and wasteful war. Victoria followed it all with deep feeling. She was no distant, uncaring queen. She wept over the casualty lists. She wrote to the widows. She knitted with her own hands for the soldiers at the front. And she visited the wounded men when they came home, walking among the maimed and the broken, speaking to them, thanking them, deeply and sincerely moved by their sacrifice. It was Victoria, in this war, who created a new honor, a small bronze cross, to be given to the bravest of her soldiers, no matter how humble their birth. It was cast, so the story goes, from the metal of captured enemy cannon. She called it the Victoria Cross, and she often pinned it upon the soldiers' breasts herself. To this day, it remains the highest award for valor a British soldier can receive, her name still spoken over acts of the greatest courage. The war ended at last in 1856 with victory of a sort, though a costly and joyless one. And life went on, and the children grew, and the great partnership at the heart of the kingdom worked on, tireless, devoted, seemingly without end. But the wider world gave little rest. Barely a year after the Crimean War ended, a far greater shock came from the other side of the earth, from India, the vast jewel of the empire. In 1857, a great rebellion broke out among the Indian soldiers of the East India Company, and it spread like fire across the north of that immense land. It was a terrible, bloody upheaval, with cruelty on both sides and dreadful massacres, and a long, grinding struggle before the rising was at last put down. News of it filled the newspapers at home for months, and Victoria followed every word with anxious concern for all her subjects there, both British and Indian alike. When it was over, the old system was swept away. The strange arrangement by which a private trading company had ruled hundreds of millions of people was ended forever, and India passed directly under the rule of the crown. It became, from that day, the direct responsibility of the Queen and her government, the great step that would one day make her its Empress. And here Victoria showed the better side of her nature. As the government prepared its proclamation to the peoples of India, she insisted personally and firmly that it be made gentle and generous and tolerant. She would not have it breathe vengeance. She demanded that it promise respect for the religions and the customs and the ancient ways of all her Indian subjects. She thought of them in her way as her people, and she meant them to be treated with justice and with care. Closer to home, the business of governing wore on, and it was not always to her liking. For much of these years, her prime minister was an old lion of a statesman named Lord Palmerston, bold, patriotic, and gloriously stubborn, who ran the nation's foreign affairs very much as he pleased. Victoria and Albert often disagreed with him deeply. He was too reckless for their taste, too fond of throwing British weight around the world without asking their opinion first. She would fume and protest and send him sharp letters, and he would bow politely and then carry on exactly as before. It was a long, exasperating tug of war, and it taught her again and again the hard lesson of a constitutional monarch, that she might advise and warn and be listened to with respect, but that in the end it was her ministers and not she who ruled. And this, in truth, was the great quiet transformation of her reign, more lasting even than all her empire. For Victoria ruled at the very moment when the crown was changing what it meant to be a crown. The old idea that a monarch governed, that the king or queen truly held the reins of power, was passing away. And in its place there grew the modern idea, the one we know today, of a sovereign who reigns but does not rule. Power had passed by her time to Parliament and to the ministers the people chose. The Queen could no longer command, but she was not, for all that, powerless. A wise writer of the age summed up her true role in 3 gentle words. She had, he said, the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. She would see her ministers and hear their plans and give her opinion freely and forcefully. She could praise and she could caution, and over 60 years, no minister could lightly ignore the counsel of a woman who had known every prime minister since before he was born. It was influence, not command. Persuasion, not power. And it suited her strange position perfectly, for it placed her above the endless squabbles of the parties, a fixed point of continuity and dignity, while the governments came and went beneath her like the tides. She learned this role slowly, and sometimes painfully, and not always gracefully. But she learned it. And in learning it, she quietly shaped the very meaning of monarchy for every sovereign who has come after her, down to the present day. Yet beyond all the politics, these were, for the royal family, the golden middle years, the fullest and happiest time of Victoria's life. The nursery at Windsor and Osborne overflowed with children, 9 in all, each one growing into a distinct little person, with their own gifts and troubles and place in their mother's complicated heart. Albert had designed for them a strict and earnest education, wanting each to grow up good and useful and dutiful as he was. It did not always work as he hoped. Some of the children flourished under it, and some quietly rebelled, and their eldest son, Bertie, the future king, chafed and struggled under the weight of his father's high expectations. But the family was, for all its strains, a real and loving one, bound close together. And it was this family, above all, that gave the world one of its most enduring pictures of a happy Victorian Christmas. For Albert had brought with him, from his German homeland, the beloved custom of the Christmas tree, a fir tree set up indoors, hung with candles and sweets and little gifts and glittering ornaments. When pictures were published of the Queen and the Prince and their children gathered happily around their candlelit tree, the fashion swept across Britain, and then across the ocean and into homes everywhere. So the next time you sit in the glow of a Christmas tree, you might remember that the custom came to the English-speaking world, in large part, through a young German prince and the family he made with an English queen. But children grow, and even the happiest family cannot hold them forever. The first to leave was Vicky, the eldest, her mother's clever, favorite child. While still very young, she had been promised in marriage to a prince of Prussia, part of the great web of royal marriages that Victoria and Albert were weaving across Europe. And so, at only 17, Vicky was married and taken away to live in distant Berlin, the first of the children to fly from the nest. Victoria wept bitterly to lose her. It was the beginning of a long scattering, as one by one, over the coming years, her sons and daughters would marry into the royal houses of the continent, and leave her, and spread her blood across the thrones of Europe. So the years turned, full and busy and, for a while, deeply content. And Victoria, in her early 40s, surrounded by her children, sustained by her beloved husband, at the very summit of the world's greatest empire, might well have thought that this happiness would simply go on, and on as it always had. But it was not without end. And here, in the gentle dark, we come to the great sorrow of Victoria's life, the shadow that would fall across all her remaining years. Let it come softly. It is a sad part of the story, but a tender one, and there is a strange piece in it too. The year was 1861, and it began for Victoria with the death of her mother. The old Duchess of Kent, the same mother who had allowed the cold Kensington system to close around Victoria's childhood, was now an old woman, and in the spring of that year she fell gravely ill. And as she lay dying, something quietly healed between them. For Victoria, going through her mother's papers, discovered letters and diaries that told a different story than the one she had believed. She found that her mother had loved her, truly and deeply, all along, and had wept over their coldness, and had been, herself, a lonely and manipulated woman, more Conroy's victim than his ally. The old bitterness dissolved into grief and into love. And when her mother died, Victoria was plunged into a sorrow that frightened those around her. She wept for days. She could not be comforted. Albert, as ever, took up the burden. He was, by now, working himself to the very edge of his strength, carrying the Queen and the government and the endless labor of the crown upon his own shoulders. He was often unwell that year, tired and thin and troubled, complaining of aches and sleeplessness, driving himself on when he should have rested. And then, in the autumn, came a new worry. Their eldest son, Bertie, the young Prince of Wales, the future king, was a source of endless anxiety to his earnest parents. He was charming and warm-hearted, but idle and pleasure-loving, everything the serious Albert was not. And that autumn, word reached them of a scandal, a foolish affair the young prince had fallen into with an actress while away with the army. Albert was horrified. To him, with his deep love of order and virtue, it seemed a catastrophe. Already ill and exhausted, he traveled to see his son, to reason with him, walking with the young man for hours in the cold and the rain. It was, some believe, the final blow to his failing strength. He came home wet and chilled and shivering, and he did not truly recover. And yet, even then, sick and failing as he was, he performed one last great service, quietly from his sickbed, that history should not forget. For at that very moment, far across the ocean, America had torn itself apart in civil war, and a dangerous quarrel had flared up between Britain and the northern states, a quarrel so sharp that the two nations stood on the very brink of war. A stiff and angry message was drafted in London, ready to be sent, a message that might well have lit the fuse. Albert, rising from his bed, weak and shaking, took up his pen and softened it. He rewrote the harshest lines, drained away the threat, and left a door open for peace. And it worked. The crisis passed. War between Britain and America was averted, in no small part by the last labor of a dying man. It was almost the final thing he ever wrote. And it was, perhaps, a fitting close to his life of patient, unseen service, this quiet act of peace, performed with his failing strength, that spared two great nations a needless war. Through the early days of December, Albert sank. At first they called it a fever, a chill, nothing to be too alarmed about. But it was worse than that. It was typhoid, that dreaded killer of the age, breeding perhaps in the bad drains of Windsor Castle itself. And slowly, day by day, the strength drained out of him. Victoria would not believe it. She had leaned on him so completely, for so long, that the thought of losing him was simply beyond her. She nursed him and hoped, and told herself he would rise again, as he always had. But the doctors' faces grew graver, and Albert grew weaker, drifting in and out of fever, wandering in his mind. On the evening of the 14th of December, 1861, it became clear that the end had come. The family was gathered. Victoria knelt by the bed, holding his hand, calling to him softly. And there, quietly, without pain at the last, Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria's grief was total, and it was terrible. It was as if the sun had gone out of her world. She had lost, in a single evening, her husband, her lover, her closest friend, her advisor, her strength, the very center and soul of her life, as she had once called him. And she was only 42 herself, with a long life still before her, and no idea at all how she would live it alone. She would mourn him, in truth, for the rest of her days. Nearly 40 more years she would live, and in all that time she never truly put aside her grief. She wore black, the deep black of a widow, every single day, until the very end of her own life. In the years that followed Albert's death, the Queen very nearly vanished from the world. Her grief became a kind of retreat, a long withdrawal into shadow. And though it was a dark time, there is something quiet and restful in it too, so let it settle softly over you now, as you drift towards sleep. She could not bear to be seen. She could not bear the noise and glare of public life. She fled from London to her quiet houses, to Osborne by the sea, and to beloved Balmoral in the Highlands, and there she shut herself away with her grief, refusing, for years, to appear before her people at all. She turned Albert's memory into a kind of shrine. His rooms were kept exactly as he had left them. His clothes were laid out fresh each day. Hot water was brought to his room every morning, for a man who would never wash again. She slept with a cast of his hand within her reach, and a photograph of him above the empty pillow beside her. She lived, in a sense, with a ghost, and she preferred his company to that of the living. And she poured out her love for him into stone and bronze across the whole land. She raised monuments to him everywhere, grand and golden and solemn. She commissioned a great memorial in London, glittering with gold, where his statue still sits beneath its soaring canopy to this day. She would not let him fade. She would not let the world forget what she had lost. Everything now was ordered around his memory. She had his sayings printed and framed. She measured her decisions by what Albert would have wished, asking herself in every difficulty what he would have done. The rooms where he had died were kept as sacred ground. She would allow nothing to be changed, nothing to be moved, as though at any moment he might return and find it all just as he had left it. Grief for Victoria was not a passing storm to be weathered and set aside. It became the very shape of her life, the black frame around all her remaining years. And yet, even in the deepest of her mourning, the old sense of duty never entirely let her go. The red boxes still came, and still she read them and signed them, working away quietly behind her walls of black even when she would not show her face. She governed still, after her fashion, a hidden queen, laboring in the shadows. There was one gentle way in those years that she reached out again toward her people, and it is a rather touching one. She decided to publish a book. Not a grand book, not a book of state, but simply her own private diary of the happy Highland days she had spent with Albert at Balmoral, the walks, the picnics, the ponies, the simple pleasures of their life among the mountains. She called it Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands. It was plain and homely and utterly without pretension, full of small domestic joys and ordinary days. And to the surprise of the fashionable world, which found it rather too simple, the ordinary people of Britain loved it. Sold and sold. For in its plain pages they met, not a distant empress, but a wife who had loved her husband, and lost him and missed him, just as any of them might. She signed herself with real humility, the humblest of authors. And through that little book, in the depth of her sorrow, the Queen and her people reached quietly toward one another once more. But the world, in truth, grows impatient with even the deepest grief when it goes on too long. And as the years passed, and the Queen remained hidden away, refusing to open Parliament, refusing to be seen, the mood of the country began to sour. People began to grumble. What was the use of a queen who was never seen? What was the use of a crown that hid itself away? There were whispers growing louder that perhaps the monarchy was an old and useless thing after all. For the first time in her reign, there rose a real and open murmur of republicanism, a real question of whether Britain needed a queen at all. They called her, with a sneer, the Widow of Windsor. Into this long, gray twilight came an unlikely source of comfort, and one that set many tongues wagging. His name was John Brown. He was a Highland servant, a gillie from Balmoral, a plain, blunt, strong, and utterly loyal Scotsman who had served the family in the happy days when Albert was alive. And in her grief, Victoria came to lean upon him more and more, until he became her constant attendant, her personal servant, and, in his rough and faithful way, her dear and trusted friend. John Brown was everything the fawning courtiers were not. He was honest. He spoke to her plainly, as no one else dared, scolding her, teasing her, caring for her with a gruff, unpolished devotion. He guarded her fiercely. He alone, it seemed, could coax her and lift her spirits and make her laugh again in those bleak years. She trusted him completely. The court was scandalized. The gossips whispered cruelly, calling her, behind her back, Mrs. Brown. They could not understand, or would not, this deep bond between the widowed queen and her plain-spoken Highland servant. But Victoria did not care what they whispered. Brown gave her comfort when she had none, and she was fiercely loyal to him, as he was to her, until the day he died years later, a loss that grieved her deeply all over again. By the early 1870s, though the grumbling against the hidden queen had swelled to its loudest and most dangerous pitch, she had been out of sight for nearly 10 years. The Republican voices were bold now, holding meetings, printing pamphlets, asking openly what a costly, invisible monarchy was even for. It was perhaps the lowest point of her reign, the moment when the crown itself seemed to totter. And then, strangely, wonderfully, it was saved, not by any clever plan, but by a brush with death, and by the simple, deep affection of ordinary people. For in the winter of 1871, her son Bertie, the Prince of Wales, fell gravely ill with typhoid, the very same fever that had killed his father, Albert. The whole nation caught its breath. Day by day the bulletins came from his sickbed, and day by day he grew worse, and it seemed certain he would die. And a terrible, poignant fact fixed itself in every mind. The crisis was falling in the second week of December, and the doctors feared he would die on the 14th, the very date, 10 years before, almost to the hour, on which his father had died. The coincidence was almost too much to bear. Victoria rushed to his side and sat through the long nights, reliving her worst nightmare, waiting for the fever to take a second beloved man from her on that same cursed date. The country waited with her. In churches across the land, people prayed for the young prince. strangers stopped one another in the street to ask for news. And in that shared fear, something quietly shifted. The people remembered that they loved their royal family after all. And then, on the very brink, the fever broke. Bertie rallied. He would live. The relief across the whole kingdom was enormous, a great outpouring of joy and thanksgiving. And a few weeks later, the Queen did something she had not done in years. She came out. She rode through the crowded streets of London in public beside her recovered son to a great service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the people cheered her until they were hoarse. The effect was extraordinary. The Republican movement, so loud a moment before, simply collapsed and melted away. The monarchy had been saved, not by argument, but by a mother's fear and a son's recovery, and by the deep, stubborn love of the people for the small woman in black. From that moment, her long climb back into their hearts was truly begun. But comfort alone could not draw her back into the world. What did that, in the end, was politics, and one man above all, one of the most remarkable characters ever to serve her, a man who understood, as no one else did, exactly how to handle a grieving queen. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. He was her prime minister, and he was unlike any statesman she had ever known. He was brilliant and witty and flattering and theatrical, a novelist as well as a politician, a man of dazzling charm and honeyed words. And where others lectured the Queen, or scolded her, or bored her, Disraeli enchanted her. He flattered her outrageously, and she loved it. He treated her not as a difficult old widow to be managed, but as a beautiful and brilliant woman, and a great queen, and the heart of a mighty empire. He wrote her letters full of wit and warmth and dazzling gossip. He made the dull business of government feel, once again, like a grand and exciting story, with herself as its heroine. Slowly, gently, with infinite skill, Disraeli drew her back toward the light. He coaxed her out of her shadows. He gave her, once more, a reason to care about the world, and a friend at the very summit of her government whom she genuinely adored. And it was Disraeli who gave her the crowning glory of her later years, a magnificent new title that thrilled her to the core. In 1876, he had Parliament proclaim Victoria not merely Queen but Empress. Empress of India. India, the great jewel of her empire, that vast and ancient land of hundreds of millions of people, was now formally hers, and she its empress. She was overjoyed. She signed herself, from then on, with a proud new flourish, Victoria, by the grace of God, Queen and Empress. And though she never once set foot in India herself, she loved it dearly, and studied its languages in her old age, and kept Indian servants at her side, and wore its jewels with pride. She did not love all her ministers so warmly as she loved Disraeli, and it must be said that the old Queen had become, by now, quite decidedly partisan. With strong likes and dislikes she made little effort to hide. And the man she liked least of all was Disraeli's great rival, the towering, high-minded, endlessly earnest William Gladstone. Gladstone was, by any measure, one of the greatest statesmen of the age, honest, brilliant, tireless, and deeply serious. But those very qualities were exactly the ones that wearied her. Where Disraeli charmed and flattered and amused, Gladstone lectured. He addressed her, she famously complained, as if she were a public meeting, delivering long, solemn speeches across the drawing room when she longed for a little warmth and wit. He led the Liberals and served as her prime minister 4 separate times across her long reign, and each time she endured him with barely concealed impatience. She disagreed with his politics, distrusted his causes, and found his moral earnestness a trial. It was, perhaps, not entirely fair of her, for he served her faithfully and well. But hearts are not fair, and hers, in old age, had grown set in its ways. Between the dazzling Disraeli and the dutiful Gladstone, she knew exactly where her affections lay. So the hidden Widow of Windsor came slowly back into the world, and as she did, a remarkable thing happened. The grumbling faded. The whispers of republicanism died away. And in their place there grew something deeper and warmer and more powerful than the simple popularity of her youth. As she aged, Victoria became something like the grandmother of the whole nation, and indeed of half of Europe. For consider her family spread now across the whole continent. She and Albert had married their 9 children into the royal houses of Europe, one by one into Germany and Russia and Denmark and Greece and beyond. Her eldest daughter became Empress of Germany. Her grandchildren sat, or would sit, on thrones from Berlin to St. Petersburg to Madrid. By the end of her life, the small woman in black at Windsor was grandmother, or great-grandmother, to a dizzying web of kings and queens and emperors. They called her, with real affection, the grandmother of Europe. The royal families of the continent were, quite literally, her descendants, bound together by her blood, a vast family of crowns, all looking to the old queen at its center. Consider, for a moment, where her 9 children went. Vicky, the eldest and cleverest, went to Prussia and became the mother of Kaiser Wilhelm, who would one day rule the German Empire. Bertie, the future king, married the beautiful and gentle Alexandra of Denmark, and would in time become King Edward VII. Her daughter Alice married into Germany too, and became, through her own daughter, the grandmother of the last Empress of Russia. Alfred went to sea and married a Russian Grand Duchess. Helena and Louise and Arthur and poor delicate Leopold, and the youngest, Beatrice, who stayed at her mother's side to the very end, all married and scattered their branches across the courts of Europe. Through these unions, Victoria's blood ran into the veins of the rulers of Germany and Russia and Greece and Spain and Romania and beyond. It was a remarkable thing, this great family she had made, spreading out across the whole continent like the roots of some ancient tree. And there is a strange and sorrowful irony in it, which history would only later reveal. For within 2 decades of her death, these very cousins, her own grandchildren, the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar and the British King, would lead their nations into the most terrible war the world had ever seen against one another. But that dark day was still far off and hidden, and the old queen at the center of her family never lived to see it. There is a sad shadow in that story, which history would only later reveal. For within her blood there traveled, unknown to her, a terrible hidden illness, a disease that prevents the blood from clotting, and she passed it, all unknowing, to sons and grandsons across Europe, a hidden inheritance that would bring great sorrow to royal families for generations to come. But she never knew it, and we need not dwell on it tonight. For there is a price to be paid for a very long life, and Victoria paid it in full. The price is this: if you live long enough, you must watch some of those you love go into the dark before you. And the old queen, who lived so very long, was made to bear that sorrow again, and again, and again. She outlived, in the end, not only her husband, but 2 of her own 9 children, and a number of her grandchildren besides. And a mother is not made to bury her children. It is a grief against the natural order of things, and it fell upon her more than once. The first to go was her gentle 3rd child, Alice, the tender-hearted daughter who had helped to nurse her father on his deathbed, and had held her weeping mother in her arms through the first terrible days of widowhood. Alice grew up and married a German prince and had children of her own, and gave her life in the end to her love for them. For when her family fell ill with diphtheria, a cruel disease of the throat, she nursed them all and caught it herself and died of it. And she died by a stroke of fate almost too bitter to believe, on the 14th of December, the very same date on which her father, Albert, had died 17 years before. That date, that dreadful anniversary, had claimed another of the Queen's beloved. And then, some years later, came the loss of her youngest son, Leopold, the frail one, the one who had been delicate and unwell all his short life, marked by that same hidden weakness of the blood. He too married and had children, and then died young, far too young, leaving a widow and little ones behind. Once more the old queen wrapped her grief about her, and went on. There were grandchildren lost as well, small graves added to the long tally of her mourning, and in time, near the very end of her life, the loss of a grandson who might one day have been king. Each death was a fresh wound. And yet there was in Victoria, alongside all her passionate feeling, a deep and stubborn strength that simply would not break. She grieved as few have ever grieved, and still she rose each morning, and read her boxes, and did her duty, and lived. Indeed, having known so much sorrow herself, she became, in her old age, a strange and gentle comforter to others in their grief. She, who had seemed so lost in her own mourning, knew exactly what to say to a widow or a grieving mother, for she had been both many times over. She wrote them letters of real tenderness. She understood their pain from the inside. Her own great sorrow had, in the end, softened her toward the sorrows of the whole world. Let us dwell instead on her triumphs, for her final years were full of them. As she grew old, the love of her people rose to a great and golden tide, and it found its expression in two magnificent celebrations, the like of which had never been seen. The first was her Golden Jubilee in 1887, marking 50 years upon the throne. 50 years. Half a century since that dawn morning when the messengers had knelt before a girl in her dressing gown. And now that girl was a stout, small, dignified old woman, and the whole empire rose to celebrate her. Kings and princes came from all over the world. London filled once more with cheering millions. And Victoria, in an open carriage, rode through the adoring crowds, the same crowds who, not so many years before, had grumbled and whispered against her. All of that was forgotten now. She was their queen, their empress, the living symbol of an age of glory, and they loved her with their whole hearts. And 10 years later, in 1897, came the greatest celebration of all, her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years upon the throne, longer than any English monarch before her had ever reigned. It was staged as a vast festival of empire, and troops came from every corner of the earth to march before her, soldiers of every color and costume and creed, all subjects of the one old woman riding slowly through the streets of her capital. She was frail now and could barely walk, and her eyes were failing. She rode the whole way in her carriage, and at St. Paul's Cathedral, the service of thanksgiving was held out of doors on the steps, so that the old queen would not have to climb down. And as she sat there, in the summer sun, before the great cathedral, surrounded by the pomp of the mightiest empire on earth, she wept. No one, she wrote that night, ever, I believe, has met with such an ovation as was given to me. Her heart was full. Every face, she felt, was filled with real joy. It was the summit of her long life and of the empire itself. Britain would never again be quite so powerful, or quite so sure of itself, as on that golden day. And at the very center of it all sat the small, black-clad, white-haired woman who had given the whole age her name. In these last years, there was one more companion who brought her comfort, and once again set the whole court muttering, just as John Brown had done. His name was Abdul Karim, and he had come to her from India at the time of her Golden Jubilee, as one of the Indian servants she was so pleased to have about her. But he did not remain a mere servant for long. Victoria took a great liking to him, this dignified young man from the far side of her empire, and she raised him up and gave him the title of the Munshi, which means teacher, and asked him to teach her his language, the Hindustani tongue of her Indian subjects. And in her old age she bent over her lessons like a schoolgirl, filling notebooks with careful Urdu script, delighting in this window into the great land she ruled but had never seen. The Munshi became her close and trusted friend, dining near her, traveling with her, sharing her days. And the court was appalled, as it had been over John Brown, only more so, for now their prejudice was sharpened by the ugliness of the age's attitudes toward race. They resented him and plotted against him, and begged her to send him away. But Victoria, stubborn and loyal to the last, would not hear of it. She defended him fiercely and kept him at her side for the whole of the rest of her life. Whatever else may be said, there was in her a deep vein of loyalty that no snobbery and no prejudice could ever move. But the peace of her final years was not to be unbroken. For as the old century died, her empire stumbled into one last, bitter war. In 1899, far away at the southern tip of Africa, fighting broke out between the British and the Boers, the descendants of Dutch settlers, in what came to be called the Boer War. It went badly at first, worse than anyone had expected. There were defeats and sieges and long casualty lists, and the whole nation was shaken. And the old queen, now 80 years old, nearly blind, and very frail, took it all deeply to heart. She would not despair. When a minister spoke gloomily of the setbacks, she is said to have drawn herself up and answered, with all her old iron, that she was not interested in the possibilities of defeat, for they did not exist. She threw what strength she had left into cheering her soldiers. She visited the wounded. She reviewed the troops. That last Christmas of her life, she sent a special gift to every soldier serving at the front, a small tin box of chocolate, stamped with her own portrait, a personal token from their aged queen. Many a soldier treasured that little tin far too much ever to eat what was inside. It was almost the last thing she did for the men who served her, this small, motherly kindness, sent out across the world from an old woman in the failing light of her reign. But even the longest reign must have its evening. And as the old century turned toward the new Victoria, at last began to fade. Let this final part come gently now. It is the close of a very long day and a very long life, and there is peace in it. She was over 80 now. Her beloved eyes had grown so dim she could barely read, and her diary, which she had kept faithfully for nearly 70 years, was written now by other hands. Her legs would no longer carry her, and she was wheeled from room to room. The old friends of her youth were long gone, and even some of her own children had died before her, a grief no mother should have to bear. She grew tired, deeply tired, in body and in soul. In the last months, she went, as she so often did, to Osborne, her house by the sea on the Isle of Wight, the house Albert had built for her so long ago, in the happy days. And there, as the winter of 1901 came on, she quietly began to slip away. There was no single illness, no dramatic blow. She was simply very old and very tired and worn out at last by her long and extraordinary life. She grew weaker through the middle of January, drifting more and more into sleep, and her vast family began to gather at Osborne, summoned to her bedside from across the kingdom and across Europe. They came, her children and her grandchildren, the kings and queens and princes of her blood. Among them came her eldest grandson, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm, who, whatever his quarrels with Britain, loved his grandmother, and who now knelt quietly by her bed and helped to support her in his arms in her final hours. And so, surrounded by those she had loved and made, in the house that Albert had built, On the evening of the 22nd of January, 1901, Queen Victoria closed her eyes, and her long day ended and she died. She was 81 years old, and she had reigned for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days. The news went out across the world by telegraph, and a strange, deep hush seemed to fall over the whole empire. For almost no one alive could remember a time before her. She had been queen for so long that she had become like a fixed and permanent thing, like the sea or the sky. Grown men and women who had never known another monarch wept in the streets. It felt, people said, as though the whole world had somehow grown older in a single night. An age had ended and everyone knew it. They would call it forever after the Victorian age, and it died with her. And what an age it had been. Think of the world into which she had been born back in 1819 and the world she left behind in 1901. When she was a child, people still traveled as they had for 1,000 years, by horse, along muddy roads, at the pace of a trotting animal. News crawled across the country no faster than a man could ride. Homes were lit, as they always had been, by candle and by firelight. The night was truly dark, and the world was truly vast, and slow and quiet. And by the time she died, all of that had changed beyond recognition. Trains raced across the land at speeds that would once have seemed the stuff of witchcraft. Words flashed around the entire globe in moments, along wires laid beneath the oceans. Great cities glowed at night with gas, and now, at the very end, with the cold new miracle of electric light. Photographs captured faces forever. Ships of iron crossed the seas without sail or oar. In the span of a single long life, her life, the world had rushed from the age of the candle into the age of the machine, and it would never slow down again. She had presided over all of it, not by ruling it, but simply by being there, steady and unchanging, through 63 years of dizzying transformation. She had become the one fixed thing in a spinning world, the still center around which an entire age had turned. And when she was gone, people felt the ground shift beneath them, as though a great mountain that had always stood on the horizon had, in the night, quietly vanished away. She had asked, in her final wishes, for a white funeral, not a black one, for she had had enough of black in her long widowhood. And into her coffin, by her own careful instruction, were placed the tokens of her whole life, a strange and touching mixture, mementos of her children, and of her long reign, and hidden among them, a photograph of her servant John Brown, and a lock of his hair, held quietly in her hand. And upon her, at the very last, was laid the wedding veil she had worn on that rainy morning in 1840, so that she might go to her grave dressed, once more as Albert's bride. And then her people said their long farewell. She had been a soldier's daughter, and she loved her army and navy dearly, and so she was given a great military funeral, the kind she would have wished. Her coffin was carried first from Osborne, her house by the sea, down to the water's edge, and taken across the narrow strait on a royal ship, while the warships of her fleet lay waiting in long gray lines. and as she passed between them, the great guns of the navy fired their slow salute, one after another, booming out across the calm winter water, a mile of ships mourning their queen beneath a pale and quiet sky. Then she was brought to London and carried through the streets of her capital one final time. Her small coffin rode upon a gun carriage, drawn slowly along, draped in white and gold, and behind it walked the kings and princes of half the world, led by her son, now King Edward, and by her grandson the German emperor, who had knelt at her deathbed. Emperors and kings, and a great slow river of soldiers, wound through the heart of the city. And the people came as they had always come for her, but this time in a vast and aching silence. They filled the streets in their hundreds of thousands, all dressed in black, and they did not cheer now, for there was nothing to cheer. They only stood and watched and wept as the little coffin passed by. Many among them had never in their whole lives known another ruler. She had been queen before their parents were born. And now she was gone, and it seemed impossible, and the silence of those enormous crowds was heavier and more eloquent than any words could ever be. At last they carried her out to Windsor, to the quiet green place where Albert already lay waiting. And there, after all the guns and all the grief, and all the long miles of mourning, the noise fell away, and there was only the stillness of the tomb, and the two of them together. For she was going at last to lie beside him. They carried her to the great mausoleum she had built for him all those years before, the resting place she had prepared, from the very first, for them both. And there she was laid down at his side, together again, after nearly 40 years apart. Their two marble figures lie there still, side by side, exactly as she wished, the young queen and her beloved prince, reunited in the quiet at last. And so ends the story of Victoria. A lonely, watched, unwanted child who became the most powerful woman in the world. A passionate heart that loved once, and wholly, and mourned for 40 years. A small woman in black who gave her name to the greatest empire the world has ever seen, and to a whole age of human history. She was not perfect. No one is. She could be stubborn and blind and difficult and wrong. But she was brave and she was faithful, and she was true to her word, that word she is said to have spoken as a child of 11, when she first understood her destiny. I will be good. In her own way, across 63 long years, she tried with all her heart to keep it. And now the tale is told, and the candles have burned down to nothing, and there is nothing left to do but rest. So let the story go now gently out of your mind. Let the queen and the prince and the whole long century fade softly into the dark. You have traveled a long way tonight, across a whole life, from a baby in a quiet palace to an old woman by the sea. And now that journey is done and you may lay it down. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let every last thought soften and blur and drift away. There is nothing to hold on to and nothing to fear. All is quiet. All is well. Sleep now. The lamp is dimming. The long story is over, and the night will keep you safe until morning. Sleep and rest and be at peace. Good night. From all of us here at Lamplight History, good night.